Have you ever wondered what's more terrifying, the criminal you instantly recognize as dangerous, or the one who hides behind a harmless teenage smile, pretending to be innocent until the very last second? And if that smile belonged to someone young, someone we're conditioned to trust, someone who looks more like a student than a threat, would you still feel safe walking into a grocery store, opening your front door, or simply passing a teenager in a quiet neighborhood? These are questions many older adults never think about until they encounter a story that shakes the ground beneath them. Because for years we've all believed that danger has a look, that evil appears in rough clothing, wild eyes, or a hardened adult face, not in a boy with a backpack or a girl who sits quietly in class. But the truth behind our title, 5 Shocking Facts About Teen Killers You Need to Know, and the reason the thumbnail reads, "He smiled, then broke down," lies in the unsettling moment detectives described after countless interrogations. The moment a teen suspect sits calmly in the interview chair, smiling as if everything is normal, right before their entire world collapses, their mask slips, and their real nature spills out in a way even investigators struggle to understand. That smile has become a symbol of something deeply disturbing, not confidence, not innocence, but a chilling emotional disconnect that older generations rarely anticipate from someone so young. And today, you're about to discover that teen killers do not fit the image society has painted for decades. They can look gentle, they can look confused, they can look like any child you've seen on the street. Yet behind that expression is a psychology far darker than most adults ever imagine. But before we reveal those 5 shocking facts, there's one question you must ask yourself. If the smile of a teenager can hide this much darkness, what else are they capable of? Because the first fact will challenge everything you thought you knew about fear itself, and it starts now. But what if the most dangerous thing about a teen killer is that they don't feel fear the way you do? To understand why teen killers can appear disturbingly calm, you first need to step inside the teenage brain, a place where logic is unfinished, consequences feel distant, and fear doesn't function the way it does in a fully developed adult mind. Neuroscientists have found that the human brain doesn't complete its development until around the age of 25, and the last region to mature is the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for judgment, empathy, and long-term decision-making. This means that when a teenager commits a violent act, they're often operating with a brain built more for reaction than reflection, more for impulse than restraint. And this incomplete wiring is precisely why older adults misread them so easily. You see a kid who should be nervous, shaking, regretful, but inside, their emotional system is firing more like a malfunctioning switchboard, where fear is delayed, responsibility is fuzzy, and consequences feel almost imaginary. It's the reason detectives often describe teen suspects as blank, unbothered, or strangely relaxed during their first hours in custody. They're not fearless, they just don't understand fear in the same way. Their mind is still in the stage of experimentation, thrill-seeking, and risk blindness. Combine that with peer pressure, emotional volatility, and an overactive reward system craving excitement, and you create a perfect storm where violence becomes possible long before the teenager grasps what violence truly means. And this is where the danger hides for many adults. When you see a teenager who looks quiet or polite, your brain instantly softens, you assume innocence. But their brain is still in construction mode, missing critical emotional tools you expect them to have. That gap between what they look like and how they actually think is the invisible threat most people overlook. And when that threat finally emerges, it rarely gives warnings you can recognize. Because inside the teenage mind, fear isn't a break, it's barely a whisper. But what happens when a teen not only lacks fear, but actually laughs after taking a life? Imagine a teenager sitting on a curb moments after committing a murder, police sirens echoing in the distance, lights flashing across his face, neighbors whispering in shock, and instead of fear, regret, or even confusion, he begins to laugh. Not a nervous chuckle, not a shaky reaction. A genuine, uncontrolled laugh that investigators later described as chillingly out of place. Cases like this have left detectives around the world stunned, and one of the most disturbing examples involved a 16-year-old boy whose reaction to killing someone wasn't panic or an attempt to escape but amusement. When officers placed him in the back of the patrol car, he grinned at the camera mounted near the roof, tapping his fingers like he was bored, as if the seriousness of what he'd done simply didn't exist in his mind. Later, inside the interrogation room, he told investigators he felt nothing, and in the moments when he did react, it wasn't sadness, it was laughter. This behavior isn't rare in teen homicide cases. Many teens display what psychologists call emotional incongruence, a state where their emotional response doesn't match the reality of their actions. Instead of fear, they show excitement. Instead of guilt, they show curiosity. And instead of remorse, they fall into a bizarre sense of detachment, where violence feels more like an event they watched rather than something they caused. For adults observing these reactions, it becomes nearly impossible to process. How could someone so young be so disconnected from what they've done? How can a teenager laugh at a moment that should shatter them? But that's the hidden truth behind teen violence. Not only is their brain underdeveloped, but their emotional compass can be wildly unstable, pointing toward thrill rather than consequence. And when investigators press deeper, they often find one frightening common thread. The laughter isn't about humor, it's about the absence of fear. But the most dangerous part is not the laughter, it's how easily adults misjudge teens because of something called the baby face bias. And that's where the next part takes us. One of the most haunting reasons teen killers slip past our instincts is something psychologists call the baby face bias, a mental shortcut that tricks the human brain into assuming that anyone with soft features, youthful skin, or gentle expressions must be innocent, harmless, or incapable of real violence. It's an evolutionary reflex. Older adults instinctively associate youth with inexperience, vulnerability, and goodness. And that reflex becomes the perfect camouflage for a dangerous teenager whose intentions are anything but innocent. Picture an adult confronting a suspicious-looking grown man. The heart quickens, the body tenses, the senses sharpen. But when that same adult encounters a teenager with round eyes, a small frame, or a shy smile, their guard drops almost instantly. Instead of danger, they see immaturity. Instead of threat, they see potential. And instead of caution, they feel an urge to guide, correct, or even protect. Detectives have countless stories where witnesses describe teen suspects as sweet, quiet, or a good kid, right up until the moment the truth came out. Stories where neighbors invited them inside during emergencies, teachers dismissed concerning behaviors as typical teenage mood swings, and even family members overlooked warning signs simply because the teen looked too young to be capable of harm. This bias is so strong that it affects law enforcement, too. Interrogators often report a strange disconnect when questioning teenage suspects. They find themselves speaking gently, choosing softer words, or giving more chances for explanation because the suspect doesn't look like a killer. But behind that soft face, the brain may be impulsive, emotionally unstable, or disturbingly detached. And when the truth finally breaks through that illusion, the shock is always the same. The realization that danger doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes it looks like someone you'd trust to hold your groceries, shovel your driveway, or walk past without a second thought. But if a harmless face can hide that much darkness, imagine what happens in the interrogation room when that mask finally cracks, and you witness the moment a teen's smile shatters into a confession. That moment is our next chapter. There is a moment in almost every teen killer interrogation that seasoned detectives dread, not because it's loud or violent, but because of how disturbingly quiet it is. It usually happens after hours of calm conversation, gentle questioning, and the familiar routine of asking a teenager to simply tell their side of the story. At first, the teen sits comfortably, sometimes even relaxed, tapping a foot, spinning a pen, or giving short, polite answers like they're talking to a school counselor instead of homicide detectives. And then comes the smile, the unsettling, almost misplaced expression detectives refer to as the last mask. It's the smile that appears when the teen thinks everything is still under control, that the adults in the room still believe them, that they can talk their way out of the unimaginable. But then the atmosphere shifts. A detective places a piece of evidence on the table, a photo, a timeline, a detail the teen didn't expect anyone to find. The room goes silent, the smile freezes. And for the first time, the teen's world begins to buckle under the weight of reality. What follows isn't immediate confession or dramatic shouting, it's something far more disturbing. The smile trembles, the eyes flicker, the breathing changes, and the brain, still underdeveloped, still emotionally unstable, begins to short-circuit between denial and panic. Detectives describe this moment as the psychological freefall, when the teen realizes that consequences are no longer distant ideas but unavoidable truths. Some teens collapse into tears. Others go blank, disconnected, almost ghost-like, and some, shockingly, start laughing again, but this time the laughter is hollow, fractured, desperate. It is in this moment, when the mask breaks, that investigators say they see the real person behind the smile. Not a monster, not a child, but something far more unpredictable, a mind that never fully understood the magnitude of its own actions until it was far too late. But if this breaking point is unsettling, wait until you hear what happens next, because the next fact reveals something even darker about teen killers, something no adult ever expects. That breaking point inside the interrogation room isn't just a dramatic moment. It's the doorway into a far deeper, far darker truth about teen killers that most adults never see coming. Because once that final smile fades and the emotional collapse begins, detectives aren't just watching a confession unfold. They're watching the result of a brain that has been operating without the safety mechanisms adults rely on. And this is where the real shock comes in. The emotional crash you see in these teens isn't the reaction to murder, it's the reaction to getting caught. That distinction is the key that horrifies investigators the most. For many of these young offenders, the act itself didn't generate fear, guilt, or even internal resistance. Their panic only appears when they realize the outside world will now hold them accountable. And this is where fact number one reaches its darkest point. Teen killers don't just feel less fear, they often feel it in the wrong moments. During the crime, their emotional system barely registers danger. During the cover-up, they feel clever, confident, or detached. But inside that interrogation room, when the evidence tightens and their imagined invincibility collapses, their brain finally sends out the fear signal it should have delivered long before. Detectives say that this delay in emotional processing creates a chilling emotional pattern. A teenager who seems calm during the unimaginable and terrified during the consequences. And that mismatch becomes the foundation for everything we explore next. Because once you understand how distorted their sense of danger is, you begin to realize something even more disturbing. Many teen killers don't act impulsively at all. In fact, some of the most shocking cases involve months of planning, sketches, journals, and detailed strategies that no adult ever noticed. So if teens can feel less fear, misread consequences, and hide behind innocent faces, what happens when they start planning their crimes long before the world catches on? That's where fact number two begins. For years, society has comforted itself with one convenient belief. When a teenager commits a violent crime, it must have been a sudden impulse, a moment of rage, a split-second decision fueled by hormones or emotion. It's easier to believe that teen violence is spontaneous, accidental, the kind of tragedy that erupts without warning and then vanishes just as quickly. But detectives who have handled teen homicide cases will tell you something radically different, something most adults don't want to hear. Many teen killers plan their crimes with a level of patience, detail, and cold focus that rivals seasoned criminals. The idea of impulsive teenage violence is a myth that blinds adults, teachers, neighbors, and even parents because it makes the danger feel smaller, more manageable, easier to explain. Yet the reality is far darker. In case after case, investigators have discovered journals filled with step-by-step instructions, phone notes listing supplies and timelines, internet searches mapping out escape routes, and even hand-drawn diagrams showing exactly how the crime should unfold. These aren't the frantic scribbles of someone losing control. These are organized blueprints created by young minds that should have been busy with homework, games, or part-time jobs. And what makes this even more unsettling is how hidden these plans often are. Teens are experts at appearing normal on the outside while building entire worlds inside their heads. They go to school, they chat with friends, they eat dinner with family, all while nurturing a plan no one around them suspects. For older adults, this truth is deeply uncomfortable because it means danger isn't always loud or obvious. It can be silent, patient, and quietly developing in someone who looks too young to understand the gravity of what they're preparing to do. And that's the real warning behind fact number two. Teen killers don't always snap. Sometimes they strategize. Sometimes they rehearse. Sometimes they build their crimes piece by piece, long before the world realizes what they're capable of. But if this planning sounds disturbing, wait until you hear about the case where a teenager documented every step of a murder in chilling detail, long before the crime even happened. Among the many teen homicide cases that shook investigators, one stands out as a chilling example of how methodical and disturbingly organized a young mind can become when it drifts into darkness. This case involved a 15-year-old who kept a private digital journal hidden behind a password-protected folder, something his parents believed was filled with school notes and harmless teenage thoughts. But once detectives gained access, they discovered a timeline of events so detailed it resembled a script rather than a diary. Every step of the planned murder was written out. The day he would choose, the exact time the victim walked home, the weather conditions that would make it easier, even the type of clothing he should wear to avoid leaving fibers behind. He listed pros and cons, rehearsed alibis, and drafted multiple versions of his explanation for when police inevitably questioned him. He wrote reminders to stay calm, notes about how to control his breathing, and chillingly a final line that said, "If I mess up, I'll adjust the plan next time." For detectives, reading this was like stepping into the mind of someone far older, far more calculating, and far more aware than anyone imagined. This wasn't an impulsive act. It wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision. It was the result of weeks, possibly months, of mental preparation carried out by someone who still asked his parents for permission to stay out late. What disturbed investigators most wasn't just the planning itself, but the emotional tone behind it. There were no signs of fear, remorse, or confusion, only curiosity and strategy. It was as if the teen viewed the entire event as a problem to solve rather than a life to destroy. And this case shattered the comforting belief that teens don't really understand what they're doing, because some do, and they plan it anyway. But what's even more frightening is how easily adults overlook the early warning signs of this kind of planning, signs that often sit right in front of them without ever being recognized. And that's where we're headed next. The most unsettling truth behind cases like these isn't just the planning. It's how easily the warning signs hide in plain sight, quietly circling the lives of adults who never imagine a teenager could be capable of such darkness. Parents, teachers, and neighbors often look directly at the clues without ever understanding what they mean, because when danger comes from someone young, the adult mind instinctively rewrites the narrative into something less threatening. A teen suddenly becoming secretive is seen as typical teenage moodiness. A locked bedroom door becomes personal space. A sudden fascination with violent content is dismissed as just movies. A drastic change in sleep patterns is blamed on school stress. And when a teen begins carrying notebooks everywhere, writing obsessively, or hiding electronics, adults often congratulate themselves for respecting privacy, never realizing that those journals and files might contain something far darker than homework. Teachers see signs too: angry doodles, disturbing essays, withdrawn behavior, sudden academic decline, but they assume it's emotional turbulence or bullying, not a blueprint for violence. Friends sometimes sense shifts as well, noticing their classmates suddenly researching weapons, asking strange hypothetical questions, or showing a cold detachment when discussing tragedy. But teens rarely report these behaviors, either out of loyalty, fear, or the belief that he's just messing around. And by the time someone finally raises concern, it's usually long after the planning has already matured into action. Detectives repeatedly warn that the earliest clues are subtle and easy to explain away, especially when they come from someone with a youthful face and a soft voice. Adults expect dramatic warning signs: shouting, aggression, constant trouble. But the teens who plan meticulously often behave the opposite way: quiet, controlled, almost invisible. That invisibility is the most dangerous part, because it blinds the very people who could have intervened before the plan turned deadly. But if the signs are so easy to miss, imagine the shock investigators feel when they finally interrogate a teen who planned everything calmly, almost like a seasoned criminal. And in the next part, you'll hear exactly how detectives uncover that hidden calm. When detectives sit across from a teenage suspect who has planned a violent crime, they often prepare themselves for fear, panic, excuses, or tears. But what they encounter instead can be far more chilling: a calmness so controlled, so precise, that it feels entirely out of place coming from someone still in their school years. Investigators describe these interviews as speaking to two people at once: the nervous teenager who fidgets with their sleeves, and the calculated planner who answers questions with an unsettling level of confidence. The most disturbing cases are the ones where the teen begins explaining their steps, not with guilt or hesitation, but with the tone of someone describing a science project. They talk about timing, opportunities, routes, and decisions with a matter-of-fact clarity that leaves detectives wondering how long the planning has been going on. Some teens even correct investigators on small details, as if they're proud of the precision. In one case, a teen calmly explained how he rehearsed his alibi in the mirror. In another, a girl told detectives she had practiced controlling her breathing to avoid appearing anxious. These aren't reactions you expect from someone overwhelmed by their own actions. They're behaviors of someone who built a narrative long before police arrived. And the strangest part is this: many teens remain emotionally flat throughout the interview until they sense detectives know everything. Only then does the fragile teenage facade crack, revealing fear, confusion, or complete emotional collapse. Investigators say the calmness isn't maturity, it's detachment. It's a teenager who has separated themselves from the moral weight of their plan, focusing only on the mechanics. This creates a psychological puzzle for adults watching from the outside. How can someone so young explain a violent act with the tone of someone discussing homework? And more importantly, what does that reveal about the darkness forming inside them long before the crime ever happened? But as dark as this cold planning is, the truth gets even worse, because some teen killers aren't just driven by anger or impulse. They're driven by something far more dangerous: the hunger for fame. And that's where the next chapter begins. As unsettling as the cold planning and calculated calmness can be, investigators say there is one motive emerging in modern teen crimes that shakes them more than almost anything else, because it reveals a shift not just in teenage behavior, but in the culture surrounding them. After years of interviewing young offenders and analyzing digital trails, detectives began noticing a disturbing pattern. A growing number of teen killers weren't driven by rage, revenge, jealousy, or impulse. They were driven by something far more twisted and modern: the desire to be seen. The hunger for attention, the craving for notoriety, the belief that any kind of fame, even the darkest kind, is still fame. In an era where likes, follows, and views define a teenager's value more than character or conscience, some young minds begin to see violence as a shortcut to significance. A dramatic surge of digital attention that they believe will finally make them matter. Detectives describe teens who posted cryptic messages before crimes, those who filmed themselves rehearsing threats, and even ones who fantasized about how the media would portray them afterward. The idea that murder could become a stage for recognition is something older generations struggle to comprehend, because they grew up in a world where attention was earned slowly, through work, reputation, community, consistency. Today, teenagers can become famous in minutes, and some, tragically, see violence as their ticket to that spotlight. This is the point where investigators say the darkness in teen crimes transforms from psychological instability to something far more intentional. A performance, a spectacle, a desperate reach for validation in a world that rewards shock more than substance. And in these fame-driven cases, the calmness, the planning, the lack of fear suddenly make a horrifying kind of sense, because the crime isn't just an act, it's a means to be remembered. But if the motive of fame sounds disturbing, wait until you hear the real-life cases where teens committed unthinkable acts just for attention and posted about it. That's where we go next. In recent years, detectives have noticed a terrifying evolution. Crimes committed not in silence, not in secrecy, and not as desperate acts of emotion, but as carefully packaged performances for an audience that often doesn't even exist. Teenagers raised in a world where every moment is documented and every feeling is broadcast have begun to view tragedy through the same lens they use for trends, challenges, and viral content. Social media has become both a mirror and a stage, amplifying their desperation to matter, to be seen, to be remembered, even if the only way they believe they can achieve that is through violence. Investigators have found teens who live-streamed their threats moments before striking, posted countdown messages hinting at something big, or crafted disturbing online personas designed to make their eventual crime feel like a twisted brand. In one chilling case, a teen uploaded a photo of himself smiling, seconds before committing a violent act, captioning it with cryptic emojis meant to shock his followers afterward. In another, a group of teens discussed committing a crime in a private chat, not to solve any personal grievance, but because they wanted their names trending. For older adults, this is almost unfathomable, violence being used as content, tragedy becoming a tool for social relevance. Yet for teens drowning in digital noise, where anonymity feels like suffocation, even negative attention becomes intoxicating. Psychologists say that the adolescent brain's reward system, already overactive, lights up even more when a post receives reactions, meaning the rush of online approval can become more addictive than the crime's consequences are frightening. And when a young person is already detached, impulsive, or emotionally unstable, this digital validation becomes a dangerous accelerant. What once would have been a passing dark thought now becomes a chance for notoriety, a chance to feel important for the first time. And for some teen killers, that craving for recognition becomes the spark that ignites everything. But the real horror emerges in the cases where teens didn't just want attention, they wanted to gain followers from their crimes. And the stories behind those cases are even darker. The idea that a teenager could take a life just to gain followers sounds like something too twisted, too extreme, too far removed from reality to ever happen, but investigators know better. They've seen the screenshots, the group chats, the deleted posts recovered from locked phones. They've watched teens confess, not with shame, but with an eerie sense of pride, because in their minds the crime wasn't just violence, it was a shortcut to relevance. One of the most disturbing cases involved a 14-year-old who recorded himself moments after attacking his victim, whispering into the camera, "This will go viral." He didn't flee, he didn't panic. He stood there waiting for the likes he imagined would pour in once the footage hit social media. In another case, two teens planned a violent act specifically for the purpose of posting it online, discussing how crazy the reactions would be and how their follower count would explode. They said it in the same casual tone other kids use when talking about filming a prank or starting a YouTube channel. And perhaps the most chilling example came from a teen girl who admitted during interrogation that she didn't even hate her victim. She simply wanted her story to be dramatic enough that people would search her name afterward. Detectives say this new strain of crime isn't driven by anger or hatred, but by emptiness, a hollow place in a teenager's identity that they believe can be filled by strangers clicking a heart icon on a screen. For adults, especially those who grew up in a world without digital validation, the idea is almost unimaginable. But for teens who measure their worth in numbers, followers, views, reactions, the line between attention and morality blurs in terrifying ways. When the desire to be noticed becomes stronger than the understanding of consequences, even the unthinkable can start to feel like an opportunity. And that is the frightening new reality investigators are now forced to confront. Some teen killers don't want to hide, they want an audience. But the question is, why would a young mind crave fame so desperately that even murder becomes a means to an end? To answer that, we must dig into the psychology behind their need for validation, and that's where the next part leads us. To understand why a teenager could ever see violence as a ticket to fame, you have to look inside the emotional architecture of the adolescent mind, a place where identity is fragile, validation is oxygen, and the line between attention and approval blurs dangerously. Psychologists say that teenagers are in the most vulnerable stage of their lives when it comes to forming a sense of self. They are constantly scanning the world for signs that they matter, that they belong, that they're noticed. But for some teens, especially those who feel invisible, ignored, or socially disconnected, this search becomes an obsession. Instead of building identity through achievements, relationships, or experiences, they begin chasing any form of validation that delivers a quick emotional hit. And in today's world, nothing delivers that faster than social media. A single notification can feel like acceptance. A string of likes can feel like belonging. And when those digital signals slow down or vanish entirely, some teens feel as if they're disappearing. That emotional emptiness can twist into resentment, bitterness, or desperation, an aching hunger to be seen, no matter the method. For emotionally unstable teens, this creates a disturbing equation. Attention equals significance, and significance is worth any price. That's why detectives increasingly encounter teen suspects who talk about their crimes not with guilt, but with an unnerving sense of accomplishment, because in their minds, the crime finally made them somebody. They weren't invisible anymore. People knew their name. The world was forced to look at them. And the saddest, most chilling part is that many of these teens don't fully grasp the gravity of their actions. They're driven by emotional impulses rather than moral frameworks, pursuing something they crave without understanding what it costs. It's not evil that guides them, it's emptiness, amplified by a digital world that rewards shock over substance. For older adults, this mindset is almost impossible to understand, but for teens drowning in silence, even infamy feels like a lifeline. But if validation can drive a teen to commit unthinkable acts, the next truth is even more disturbing, because some teen killers don't even fully comprehend what death means. And that's where we go next. When investigators began comparing modern teen homicide cases, they noticed a disturbing thread running through many of them, evidence that revealed not just the crime, but the motive behind it. The pursuit of fame. What shocked detectives wasn't only the brutality of these acts, but how openly some teens documented their intentions. Digital footprints became confessionals, saved drafts of posts, deleted stories recovered from cloud backups, private messages outlining how they wanted their crime portrayed, and even mock-ups of how they hoped news articles would display their mugshot. One investigator described a case where a teen had bookmarked multiple notorious criminal profiles, studying what made them go viral. Another recalled finding a folder on a suspect's phone titled Future Fans, filled with screenshots of online communities that glorified violent offenders. These weren't random accidents, they were blueprints for infamy, and the more detectives dug, the more they realized how calculated some of these acts truly were. Some teens rehearsed the emotional look they planned to show in court. Others pre-wrote captions for the posts they intended to upload after the crime. A few even choreographed their actions, treating violence like a performance they hoped would elevate them out of the anonymity they despised. For adults, especially those who grew up valuing privacy, respect, and quiet reputation, this mindset feels unthinkable. But investigators say fame-driven killers are part of a new psychological landscape shaped by digital validation, where attention, any attention, feels like a form of survival. To these teens, consequences are distant and abstract, but the idea of their name suddenly trending feels immediate, electrifying, and irresistible. And that explains the eerie calm detectives often notice in them. They're not processing the moral weight of their actions, they're picturing the spotlight they believe is coming. It's a delusion that evaporates only after the arrest, when the silence of reality replaces the applause they imagined. But as shocking as these fame-hungry cases are, the next truth cuts even deeper, because many teen killers don't just lack remorse, they lack a real understanding of death itself. And that chilling misunderstanding is where our next part begins. As investigators sift through case files, diaries, interrogation tapes, and digital footprints of teen killers, one truth becomes more unsettling than all the others. Many of these teenagers don't fully understand what death means. They can describe it, repeat the definition, and even mimic adult reactions, but emotionally, deep down where empathy and moral grounding lie, the concept remains shockingly abstract. Detectives say it becomes painfully clear during interviews, when a teen who has committed a violent act talks about their victim as if they've merely disappeared, or as if the situation could somehow reset once the dust settles. In fact, many officers recount moments where a teen asks questions so disconnected from reality: will they be okay tomorrow? When can I apologize? Can they wake up later? That the room falls silent, not from cruelty, but from disbelief. This cognitive disconnect is rooted in the adolescent brain's underdeveloped emotional processing. Teens experience consequences differently. Long-term effects feel distant, surreal, or even reversible. They're used to video game respawns, movie resets, digital do-overs, and social media cycles where nothing ever truly ends, it just refreshes. So when a teen commits an irreversible act, their emotional and psychological system often fails to grasp the permanence. Instead of horror or regret, they display confusion, shock, or a blank calmness, because their mind cannot bridge the gap between the act and the finality of death. Detectives describe it as talking to someone who understands the words of reality, but not the weight of it. And that is why the crimes committed by teenagers can feel so unnervingly cold. They're driven by impulses or motives that never fully calculate the outcome. Adults watching these cases struggle to comprehend how someone could destroy a life without understanding what they've done. But for many teens, death is not a concept shaped by experience. It's shaped by screens, stories, and fantasies that collapse the moment reality hits. And when detectives force them to confront the truth, the reaction is rarely rage or denial. It's a stunned, confused silence, as if they're seeing the consequences for the very first time. But if teens truly believe death is temporary, or somehow less real than it is, imagine the chilling behavior that follows, because some talk about death the same way they talk about video games. And that's where the next part takes us. One of the most haunting revelations detectives share about teen killers is how often they encounter a surreal, almost childlike misunderstanding of death itself, an emotional disconnect so profound that it borders on the unbelievable. During interrogations, many teens speak about their victims as if the situation were temporary, as if the person they harmed is simply unconscious, injured, or gone for now, not permanently gone. In one case, a 15-year-old kept asking officers, "So when will he wake up?" Even after hours of questioning. He wasn't being sarcastic, he wasn't pretending. His brain genuinely could not process the permanence of what he had done. Another teenager repeatedly said, "I just need to say sorry when he gets better," as if the aftermath of a killing were something that could be repaired with a conversation and a promise to change. Detectives say moments like these are the hardest to witness, not because the teens are cruel, but because their emotional development is so far behind the reality of their actions. It's as if they understand violence in theory, but not in consequence. They've grown up surrounded by fictional violence, movies where heroes survive impossible injuries, video games where characters respawn endlessly, social media clips where danger is entertainment rather than tragedy. This constant exposure shapes a mental framework where death feels reversible, almost like a dramatic scene that eventually fades out. Adults hear these statements and feel sickened, but to the teens speaking them, the questions feel logical. They cannot emotionally grasp the finality of death because they have no real-world experience with it. And when detectives finally explain the truth, the reaction is rarely dramatic, no screams, no intense breakdowns. Instead, it's a slow, dawning horror, a stunned confusion as the permanence sinks in inch by inch. Their faces don't twist with guilt, they freeze with realization. Because for many of them, this is the first time death has ever felt real, and it's because they caused it. But this disconnect goes even deeper. Some teens talk about death not just as if it's temporary, but as if it's a game mechanic, a reset button, something that can be undone. And the next part exposes just how dangerously blurred that line can become. Detectives often say the most unsettling conversations they've had with teen killers aren't the confessions, the explanations, or even the lies. It's the moments when a teenager talks about death with the same casual detachment they use when describing a video game. In case after case, officers report hearing phrases like, "I didn't think it would be permanent, I thought it would just restart," or "it didn't feel real," spoken with a sincerity that stops investigators cold. These aren't excuses. These are glimpses into a generation raised on digital worlds where consequences vanish with a reset, where characters fall and rise again without explanation, where violence is dramatic but never final. In one particularly chilling interrogation, a 16-year-old compared his actions to losing a life in a game, saying he expected things to go back to normal. He struggled to understand why adults reacted with such horror because, in his mind, the seriousness hadn't fully registered. Another teen told detectives he felt separated from what happened, like he was watching himself from outside his body, an emotional dissociation that mirrors the way players watch avatars on a screen. Psychologists say this disconnect is a product of both brain development and cultural conditioning. Teens spend countless hours in worlds where danger is thrilling, controlled, and without lasting consequences. They're still developing emotional systems absorb these patterns, blending fantasy and reality in ways adults often underestimate. So when a teen with poor impulse control, emotional instability, or deep loneliness acts out violently, the part of their brain responsible for interpreting finality simply lags behind. They experience the moment, but not the meaning. They understand the action, but not the aftermath. And the result is a chilling emotional flatness that detectives describe as non-human, but not inhuman, a void where comprehension should be. Adults hear these comments and recoil. Teens speak them with confusion, not cruelty. But the danger lies in that confusion, because it fuels actions that have irreversible consequences, long before the young mind understands what irreversible even means. But if this emotional disconnection explains how they think, the next question is even more disturbing. Why are some teen killers emotionally trapped in childhood, unable to grasp adult realities at all? The next part reveals that hidden emotional immaturity. Detectives and psychologists often describe teen killers as being out of sync with reality, but the truth runs much deeper than simple confusion. Many of these teens aren't thinking like adults at all. They're emotionally frozen in a childlike state, trapped in a mindset where consequences feel imaginary, responsibility feels optional, and the world still bends around their impulses. Emotional maturity doesn't develop at the same speed as physical growth. A teenager might look tall, speak confidently, and mimic adult behaviors, but emotionally they can remain startlingly young. And when a young mind carries out an adult-level act of violence, that gap becomes terrifyingly clear. Investigators recount moments where teens who committed murder reacted the way a child would when breaking a household rule, covering their face, asking if they were in trouble, or insisting they didn't mean it, even when the evidence proves otherwise. They speak in repetitive phrases, their voices crack, their reasoning spirals into naive explanations that reveal just how undeveloped their emotional landscape truly is. In one interrogation, a teen asked if things could go back to normal once he apologized. In another, a girl questioned whether she could start over like a school assignment. These are not the words of someone who understands the gravity of life and death. They're the words of someone who has never emotionally stepped out of childhood. Psychologists say this immaturity stems from underdeveloped empathy, delayed emotional regulation, and the absence of real-world experience with loss, pain, or permanence. Adults instinctively assume that a teen committing a violent act must be hardened or monstrous, but the reality is often the opposite. Many are emotionally unequipped to grasp the world they've stepped into. That immaturity creates a dangerous combination, adult-level power with child-level comprehension. They know how to act, but not what their actions truly mean. They can mimic adult words, but not adult responsibility. And when confronted with the reality of what they've done, they collapse not out of guilt, but out of shock that the world no longer bends to their imagination. But the most haunting part comes next, because when detectives finally force these teens to confront the truth, they have to break through this fragile emotional shell. And the way investigators shatter that illusion is darker than you might expect. Breaking through the emotional fog of a teenage killer is one of the most delicate and psychologically brutal tasks a detective ever faces. They're not just trying to solve a crime, they're trying to penetrate a mind that often cannot comprehend the permanence, the gravity, or even the reality of what has happened. Investigators say the process feels less like an interrogation and more like dismantling a wall built out of denial, immaturity, and fantasy. The first step is patience. Detectives avoid confrontation at the start because pushing too hard only strengthens the teen's childlike belief that everything can still be undone. Instead, they guide them gently through the facts, watching for the moment a crack appears, the flicker of confusion, the hesitation in their voice, or the sudden stillness that signals the truth has hit a nerve. Then comes the evidence. Photos, timelines, recovered messages. Each piece is designed not just to prove the teen's involvement, but to force their mind to confront reality. Detectives place these items carefully, one by one, as if laying bricks that box in the teen's imagination. And when these young suspects realize there is no way out, no story left to hide behind, their reaction is often painfully childlike. Some shut down emotionally, curling inward like they're bracing for punishment. Others plead for a second chance as though they broke a rule, not a life. Some cry in confusion rather than remorse, overwhelmed by a reality they're experiencing for the first time. A few simply stare, unable to speak, their world collapsing under the weight of permanence they never understood before. Detectives say this moment is when the mask truly falls, not the fake confidence, not the rehearsed calm, but the raw, unfiltered emotional state of someone who finally sees what they've done. It's not triumph, it's not cruelty. It's a stunned collapse, a psychological freefall that reveals just how unprepared their mind was to face the consequences of adult actions. But if all this seems dark, the next truth is far more terrifying, because while some teens misunderstand death, others learn to mimic emotions so perfectly that even adults can't tell what's real. And that's where fact number 5 begins. As detectives guide teen suspects through the collapse of their own illusions, they begin noticing something even more disturbing, something that separates impulsive acts from calculated minds. Some teenagers don't cry out of confusion. They don't break down in shock. They don't freeze in disbelief. Instead, they watch the detectives. They observe. They study every reaction in the room as if they're learning a role in real time. And then slowly, they begin to mimic whatever emotion they think will protect them. Investigators say this is where teen cases take a chilling turn, because while many young offenders struggle emotionally to understand the weight of their actions, a smaller but far more dangerous group learns to replicate empathy, fear, or remorse with startling accuracy. These teens know exactly what adults expect to see: trembling hands, watery eyes, a cracking voice, and they manufacture those reactions like actors rehearsing a scene. It's not real emotion, it's strategy. A performance crafted from watching others. One detective described a teenage suspect who remained calm and blank for hours until he noticed the investigators' frustration. Suddenly, the teen covered his face, began breathing heavily, and whispered, "I'm sorry," in a perfect imitation of a remorseful breakdown. But the moment detectives left the room, the performance slipped. Surveillance footage captured him relaxing, stretching, even smirking. Another teen practiced looking sad in the mirror before turning himself in. These aren't hardened criminals. They're adolescents who have learned to copy emotions the same way they copy trends, slang, or social behaviors from their environment. Their empathy isn't real, it's reflected, borrowed, phantom emotion used as camouflage, and that ability makes them incredibly difficult to read because adults instinctively trust tears, shaking voices, and trembling hands. But detectives know those signs can be fabricated with frightening precision. This is the point where the line between manipulation and emotional emptiness begins to blur, where a teen may not understand the full meaning of their actions, but they understand how to appear innocent long enough to confuse everyone watching. It's this mimicry, this unsettling imitation of humanity, that launches us into the darkest truth of all. Because if teens can copy emotions so convincingly, how can anyone tell the difference between fake sadness and genuine fear? In the next part, we uncover exactly how experts expose that deception. One of the most unnerving patterns investigators encounter is the way some teen killers learn to copy emotions they don't truly feel, wearing expressions of fear, regret, or sadness like masks they've borrowed for the moment. Unlike adults whose emotional responses are shaped by years of experience, teens often rely on observation, studying the people around them, the characters they see on television, or the reactions they've watched in movies and social media clips. When these teens enter an interrogation room, they aren't just answering questions, they're performing. Detectives describe them as emotional chameleons, shifting tone, posture, and expression based on whatever reaction they believe the adults want to see. A teen may sit blank and emotionless until they realize the room grows tense, and suddenly they'll lower their eyes, scrunch their face, and take shaky breaths, believing that tears will soften suspicion. Another may begin mimicking the posture of someone remorseful, hunched shoulders, quivering voice, hands covering the face, even though the emotional depth behind those gestures is completely absent. Some study detectives' expressions like mirrors, adjusting their own reactions in real time, testing which performance earns sympathy and which earns pressure. Investigators say these moments feel eerie, not because the teen is monstrous, but because the disconnect is so wide, like watching someone pretend to understand a language they've never actually learned. These teens know adults expect guilt, so they mimic guilt. Adults expect fear, so they mimic fear. But beneath these imitations lies a hollow emotional structure, undeveloped and unsteady, incapable of producing the real empathy the situation demands. And this mimicry can fool even trained adults, creating false impressions and misleading emotional cues that complicate investigations. Detectives must learn to separate instinct from illusion, knowing that what looks like remorse may simply be mimicry from a teen who has learned that tears are a universal shield. But experts have developed ways to tell when a teen's emotions are genuine and when they're nothing more than a performance. In the next part, we dive into the subtle signs that expose fake sadness from real fear. To the untrained eye, a teenager crying in an interrogation room might look genuinely devastated, shaking hands, broken voice, trembling shoulders. But experts who study body language and emotional behavior know a disturbing truth. Not all tears are real, and not all sadness comes from remorse. Some teen killers are simply acting, mimicking emotions they believe will soften consequences, especially when dealing with adults who instinctively feel protective toward youth. That's why investigators rely on subtle, almost invisible cues to tell the difference between genuine panic and rehearsed sadness. One of the strongest indicators is the timing. Real emotions rupture without warning, sudden, messy, unpredictable. Fake emotions tend to appear conveniently, right after a detective challenges a story or presents evidence. Another clue lies in the eyes. True panic dilates pupils, forces rapid blinking, and breaks eye contact in erratic patterns. Fake sadness often includes exaggerated downward gazes or forced staring at the floor, choreographed rather than spontaneous. Genuine fear affects breathing, the chest tightens, breaths shorten, and the voice becomes strained. But in a performance, the rhythm is off. Teens may overdo the shaky breathing, forgetting that fear also stiffens the body, not just the voice. Experts also watch for physical stillness. When someone is truly panicked, their body can't stay controlled, hands tremble unpredictably, shoulders tense involuntarily, and legs shift without conscious decision. A teen faking sadness will often cover their face too neatly, cry without tears, or check the detective's reaction mid-sob to see if it's working. Investigators describe it as watching someone wear emotions like a costume, convincing at a glance, but empty when studied closely. And once detectives spot the performance, their strategy changes. They stop responding to the tears and instead lean into the evidence, watching the teens act crumble once they realize the emotional shield won't work. It's in these moments that the veneer of innocence breaks, revealing the truth behind the mask. There was never remorse, only calculation. But nothing exposes emotional mimicry more brutally than the moment when a teen's fake sadness collapses, when detectives push just hard enough for the performance to shatter. And the next part reveals one of the most chilling examples of that breakdown. Detectives say there is nothing more unsettling in an interrogation room than the moment a teenager who has been perfectly calm, cold even, suddenly shatters. It doesn't happen gradually. It doesn't come with warning. It hits like a psychological earthquake that splits the room in two. In one of the most haunting cases investigators recount, a 17-year-old boy sat across from them for nearly 3 hours, answering every question with a level, almost teacher-like tone. He explained his day. He described his movements. He insisted he had nothing to do with the crime. Not once did his voice crack, his breathing change, or his posture shift. Even when confronted with evidence that contradicted his story, he simply adjusted his words as if revising a homework assignment. The detectives knew he was lying, but his emotional control was so unnervingly steady that even veteran officers felt a chill. Then came the breaking point, a piece of evidence recovered from his phone, a video clip he didn't realize had automatically backed up. When detectives placed the printout of the video still in front of him, something in his expression flickered. His eyes didn't widen, his breathing didn't quicken, instead he froze completely. And in that stillness the performance fell apart. His hands began to tremble, but not with sadness or guilt. It was fear, raw and sudden, like a child who finally realizes the lie is over. Within seconds, the emotion he had been rehearsing collapsed into something jagged and unfiltered. He started to cry, not the soft tears of remorse, but the shaking, guttural sobs of someone whose fantasy of control had just been torn away. Detectives describe this moment as the emotional collapse, when the mask cracks so violently that the teen can no longer hold any expression together. It's not just the truth being exposed, it's the fragile psyche underneath, the one that never understood the gravity of his actions until the evidence made escape impossible. That collapse becomes the turning point in almost every interrogation of a teen killer, revealing the unsettling truth beneath the performance. There was never maturity, never calmness, never real remorse, only a mask cracking under pressure. But this emotional collapse leads to something even more chilling, the final psychological breakdown, where the teen's entire persona crumbles, revealing the truth behind that last haunting smile. And that's what the next part exposes. Detectives say the most haunting moment in any teen killer interrogation isn't the confession, the tears, or even the collapse. It's the strange, unsettling smile that appears right before everything falls apart. They call it the last smile, a final flicker of the persona the teen has been trying to maintain, the mask they desperately hope will protect them from the truth. This smile doesn't show joy or confidence or even defiance. It shows denial, pure, fragile denial clinging to the last thread of control. In one unforgettable case, a 16-year-old suspect had just been confronted with irrefutable evidence: fingerprints, digital logs, eyewitness statements. The room was quiet, the air felt heavy, and instead of crying or panicking, he smiled, just slightly, just enough for the detectives to recognize the psychological reflex. It was the smile of someone trying to convince themselves that maybe, somehow, everything would still be okay. But that moment marks the final turning point. After the smile, the collapse is inevitable. The teen's breathing shifts from controlled to frantic. Their hands clutch their face, as if trying to hold their identity together, and their voice cracks under the weight of reality. Detectives describe it as watching a facade crumble in real time, the perfectly rehearsed emotions falling away, the imitated innocence evaporating, the last remnants of childhood clashing violently with the consequences of adult actions. And when the collapse happens, it's not remorse that emerges. It's shock, terror, confusion. The teen isn't processing the life they took, they're processing the life they just lost. The future abruptly gone, the fantasy shattered, the illusion that everything was still reversible now destroyed. The smile, that final flicker of denial, becomes the eerie symbol of this breakdown, the moment before the mind fractures under truth. And investigators say they never forget it, not because it's dramatic, but because it reveals the deepest truth of all. Teen killers often have no emotional anchor, no moral framework, no understanding of the irreversible damage they caused. Only when their world collapses do they begin to comprehend what adults already knew. But now that we've seen the psychology behind the smiles, collapses, and confessions, one final question remains: what does all this mean for the real world? And that's exactly where the next chapter takes us. After witnessing the emotional mimicry, the denial, the collapses, and the chilling calmness that often defines teen killer interrogations, detectives say one question continues to haunt them long after the case is closed. What does this actually reveal about the young minds committing these crimes? Because when you put everything together, the lack of fear, the calculated planning, the hunger for validation, the shallow understanding of death, the fragile emotional maturity, and the ability to imitate feelings rather than experience them, you begin to see a disturbing portrait of adolescence in crisis. This isn't just about crime, it's about growing up in a world where consequences feel distant, empathy develops slower, identity is unstable, and digital culture amplifies every insecurity. Teen killers aren't simply younger versions of adult criminals, they're something far more unpredictable. Their motives shift like sand, their emotional states swing wildly between childhood and adulthood, and their sense of reality is shaped by screens, fantasies, and pressures most older adults never had to face. For detectives, the scariest realization is not that teens are capable of committing violent acts, it's how little they understand the depth of those acts until it's far too late. Their brains are unfinished, their moral reasoning is shaky, their sense of identity is fragile. Yet in the moments leading up to a violent act, they hold the power of adults without the comprehension of adults, creating a deadly imbalance that can turn impulsive thoughts into irreversible tragedies. And while investigators can piece together motives and patterns, they admit one truth with unsettling consistency: teen killers exist in a space between innocence and danger, empathy and emptiness, imitation and reality. They hide behind smiles, collapse under pressure, and reveal their inner fragmentation only when the weight of truth crushes the roles they've tried to play. It's this psychological complexity, this haunting mixture of youth and violence, that leaves detectives, families, and entire communities asking the same question. How does society protect itself from a threat that looks so familiar, so harmless, and so heartbreakingly young? And that brings us to the final stretch of this story, because what these cases mean for the real world, and for the adults who must navigate it, is far more unsettling than you might expect. Next, we uncover what investigators believe older generations need to know right now. When detectives step back from the interrogation rooms, the case files, and the digital footprints, they often admit a truth that should unsettle every adult listening. Teen violence is not just a youth problem. It's a societal warning, one that grows louder each year as teenage behavior becomes more unpredictable, more impulsive, and more detached from the emotional grounding older generations rely on. For adults who grew up believing danger had a look, a sound, a clear warning sign, these stories force a painful reconsideration. because the teen killers investigators encounter don't fit the stereotypes. They're not hardened criminals lurking in dark alleys. They're kids walking sidewalks, riding bikes, attending school, scrolling through their phones, kids who, on the surface, seem harmless. And that is what makes the threat so disarming. Older adults, especially those who instinctively see youth as fragile or trustworthy, face a world where danger no longer announces itself with adult edges. Instead, it hides behind teenage faces, polite tones, and social media profiles filled with jokes and music clips. Modern teens live in an emotional landscape shaped by digital noise, constant comparison, and pressures that didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago. When that unstable world mixes with immature brains, poor impulse control, or a hunger for validation, the results can be catastrophic in ways previous generations could never have predicted. Detectives worry because they've seen firsthand how quietly things escalate, how a teen can move from isolation to obsession, from fantasy to planning, from planning to violence, all while the adults around them remain unaware. For seniors who value safety, community, and predictable behavior, this truth is especially chilling. Danger today isn't always external. Sometimes it grows quietly in the minds of those who seem too young to understand the weight of their own actions. And while these cases may be rare, their impact is enormous, shattering families, communities, and the sense of trust that older generations depend on to feel safe in a fast-changing world. But if this is the new reality, what do investigators believe adults, especially older adults, need to understand most urgently? The next part exposes exactly what detectives wish every person knew about the hidden world of teen killers. When detectives talk privately about the cases that stay with them the longest, they don't describe the crime scenes or the courtrooms. They describe the dangerous illusions adults carry about young offenders. The biggest misconception, they say, is that teenagers are too inexperienced, too innocent-looking, too young to pose a real threat. But investigators warn that this assumption blinds adults to subtle warning signs and makes communities vulnerable to dangers they never expected. They want every adult, especially older adults who grew up in safer, slower eras, to understand that modern teens operate inside a psychological environment that barely resembles the one older generations knew. Today's teens have unlimited access to violent content, social pressure, online anonymity, and digital validation that can distort their emotional development in unpredictable ways. Detectives have watched teens commit violent acts without understanding the consequences, mimic emotions they don't feel, plan crimes with chilling precision, and collapse only when their fantasy collides with reality. They emphasize that the danger isn't that all teens are violent. It's that some teens mask their instability so well that adults never see the storm gathering beneath the surface. Investigators say adults must stop assuming that a soft voice, polite smile, or youthful appearance means safety. Teen killers often blend into normal life effortlessly, showing no outward signs until it's too late. Detectives stress that communities need to acknowledge the truth. A teenager can be emotionally immature and extremely dangerous at the same time. A teen can lack remorse not because they're evil, but because they literally don't understand the finality of what they've done. And most importantly, adults must learn to trust behavior over appearance. A teen's face does not reveal their capability. Their size does not reveal their intent. Their age does not reveal their emotional depth. Investigators wish every adult knew that danger today can come from places you'd least suspect, from young people who themselves don't fully grasp the consequences of their actions until the world closes in on them. But even with everything investigators have learned, one final truth remains, the darkest, most unsettling truth about teen killers that society still refuses to face, and that is what comes next. After decades of cases, interviews, and shattered communities, investigators have reached a conclusion that few people want to accept. Society isn't just unprepared for teen killers, it's in denial about them. We cling to the comforting belief that youth equals innocence, that childhood is a shield against true darkness, and that a teenager's mistakes can always be corrected before they become irreversible. But detectives, psychologists, and forensic experts know that these assumptions blind us to a far harsher reality. The truth is that teenage minds are far more volatile than most adults realize. They are deeply emotional, yet emotionally inexperienced. They crave attention, yet don't understand consequences. They can imitate maturity, but lack the internal structure that makes morality stable. And when those unstable forces collide with anger, jealousy, loneliness, or the lure of fame, the result can be catastrophic. Society struggles to accept this because the villain is supposed to look like a villain, older, hardened, threatening, not like a kid in a hoodie who still lives at home and texts friends about school. The idea that someone so young can commit acts that destroy multiple lives feels unnatural, almost unbearable, so we create narratives that make us feel safer. They were influenced, they didn't mean it, they just made a mistake. But investigators say these narratives ignore the deeper truth, that a teen's emotional and psychological immaturity doesn't make them less dangerous. In some cases, it makes them more unpredictable, more impulsive, and more disconnected from the weight of their actions. And this disconnect is what society continually fails to confront. We underestimate them because they look harmless. We excuse red flags because they seem young. We trust them because we want to believe youth equals goodness. Yet history, cases, and evidence show that the most chilling crimes can come from the most unexpected faces. And until society accepts that danger can wear the mask of youth, these tragedies will continue to catch communities off guard, shattering trust where it feels safest. And that brings us to the final question. After everything you've heard, what does this mean for the world moving forward? What should older adults, families, and communities take away from these dark truths? The final part brings it all together. After all the cases, the psychology, the warning signs, and the shattered illusions, one truth rises above everything else. Teen killers are not defined by their age. They are defined by the dangerous space between who they appear to be and who they really are. And that gap is where tragedy grows. When you think back to the thumbnail, "He smiled, then broke down," you begin to understand why that moment is so haunting. That smile, so small and seemingly harmless, represents the illusion society depends on. The belief that young faces equal safety, innocence, and second chances. But when detectives watch that smile collapse into panic, they see something far darker, an emotional awakening that comes too late, a realization that hits only after a life has been taken and consequences have crashed down. It is the moment innocence ends, masks fall, and the truth finally surfaces. The title of this story, 5 Shocking Facts About Teen Killers You Need to Know, was never meant to shock for entertainment. It was meant to expose the hidden world adults rarely see, the psychological chaos inside teenage minds, and the quiet storms that can erupt without warning. Because the reality is this: the most unsettling threats aren't always the loud ones. Sometimes they come from the places we least expect, the smiling faces, the polite voices, the kids who blend in. Many teens who commit violent acts don't understand death, don't understand consequences, and don't understand themselves. They aren't monsters, they're catastrophes in the making, shaped by unfinished brains, digital pressures, emotional fractures, and a world that grows more confusing by the day. And for older adults who grew up trusting their instincts, that world feels unfamiliar, unstable, and deeply unsettling. But awareness is power. Understanding the patterns, recognizing the warning signs, and letting go of comforting myths can help communities stay safer and more vigilant. Teen killers are rare, but when they emerge, the damage is permanent, and the wake they leave behind is felt for generations. And if this story left you wondering what other hidden dangers society overlooks, the next case we uncover will take you even deeper into the shadows, where the most ordinary people hide the darkest secrets.